thank you all for joining us. I know it's the end of the day, so we'll try and keep it entertaining. Assurance. Okay. So basically what you see on the screen is the ecosystem that we've developed to kind of connect the dots, right? And the idea is a cohesive strategy, bringing in multiple disciplines so that we have a very cohesive security strategy, right? So the way it works, and we'll get into details. So this is just an overview. As we go along, each of us will break down our areas of expertise and kind of go through them. But we want to kind of paint the picture for you and how it works. The ultimate goal here is to provide a trustworthy code to our customers, right? And that's what we're going for here. So we bring in different disciplines, different programs, and collect that information, and then on the back end use it in different ways. So the idea is that you have the BUs, they're creating the product, they're doing the coding, they go through their build pipeline, they create an inventory. So you'll hear me talk a couple, as I talk about DMP and maybe as Cassi talks about PSIRT, we'll talk about inventory, we'll talk about SBOM. What I want you all to understand, inventory is really how we look at it. So inventory is the intake. When we talk about dependency inventory, dependency management, inventory is that intake, right? So product teams are going through their build, they're putting together an inventory of components. Those components are both third party and internal. So third party could be a supplier or it could be open source, right? So we'll talk about inventory going into dependency management, and then we'll talk about an SBOM coming out. Let's be clear, they're SBOMs, right? They're all SBOMs, right? We are using SPDX right now. We're using 2.3, both on the intake and the export. But we separate, like I said, we'll talk about inventory on the front end, SBOM on the back end. So if I talk about this, y'all know what I'm talking about. With that, we take information from the BUs, not only the component inventory, but there's a program going on within the BUs, or actually it's within SRO, but working with the BUs for open source software assurance. And so as part of that, they've developed a open source trustworthiness score that we're using. And so criteria has been put together. The way it will work is that there is a trusted repository, so you can see that. So developers will no longer be able to just go out and grab any open source. They'll have to go through the trusted repository. As part of that process of going from I need to use this to you're allowed to use this, there'll be some review of it and make sure that it adheres to everything. There'll also be a score attached to it. So the idea of the score, I believe at this point, is to simply give guidance. It may become more of a gate, a gateway for developers to use it, but I think at this point it's just merely guidance. With that said, a couple of things. So on the TPRM side or the procurement side, we're working with TPRM. We're trying to get information out of our systems there so that we can standardize suppliers. So we're going to look at suppliers to start with. We're going to standardize that information. All of that goes into the DMP or the dependency inventory. Once we have all of this in there, and again, on the TPRM side, we're going to have a supplier trustworthiness score as well. Again, it'll help us down the line. And as both Julia and Cassi start to talk about their details, you'll start to see where it all kind of comes together. But then, once everything's in the inventory repository, and I'm going to say this, Everybody talks about SBOMs, right? SBOMs. But if you don't have the inventory and you don't have the inventory in a quality format and you know what you're doing, we build wrappers around that whole process. We do have, I'll be honest, we have an SCA tool that is back-ending us on that process, but we've built tools around it so that we can do checks as we're importing that. If something doesn't meet our quality standards, we kick it back to the BUs and they have to update it before it'll come into us. One of the other things is that as part of our controls, they are required to register that inventory in there so that we know exactly what's going out the door. Again, when I talk about quality, it is not content so much as it is maybe format and making sure that certain fields are adhered to, things like that. We have no idea what goes into their product. They do, they're responsible for that. But we're going to check to make sure that they do certain things. So on the supplier side, we're going to make sure that they're using a standardized naming for the suppliers so that we can go through and look at, you have Dell EMC, the Dell Technology, whatever it is. We're going to try to standardize that so that we can look across our inventories to be able to see what suppliers, what BUs are using, what suppliers. It'll help, one, in the trustworthiness of that supplier and make sure that we're doing the right things for our customers. Two, negotiations, those types of things. As we get to the dependency management, we're going to bring those supplier SBOMs in, things like that, so it'll help with that. Everything in there feeds out, right? So we talked about SBOM and that goes out to the customers. There's a whole program around SBOMs. I think Aditi's been here a couple of times to talk about it. We're also going to do metrics on all of this, right? So a lot of the information that we have is going to be driven through metrics, dashboards. It'll help with remediation. It'll help with guidance. It will help with, where do we have to change processes or educate people in what they're doing. And then finally, the PSIRT side of things, right? So outputting vulnerability reports and then, being able to apply VEX to those and being able to be ahead of our customers, right? So we know what we have. We know the vulnerabilities that are associated with them. We know how these impact our products. Spent a lot of time on that. I'm sorry. So here's where I live. Dependency management. So this came about, we started, as I said, there's an SCA tool underneath this. We started with SCA. We were talking about, finding out open source, right? And using that. When Log4j came around, we said, oh, we can use this tool to figure out who's impacted. And then we said, oh, we can look at inventories across the board. And then the EO came out and we were like, okay, now we're going to know everything, right? We're going to, as a part of the executive order, 14028, not that I have that memorized, but as a part of that, we had to make sure that we understood all components going in. So that's where dependency management platform really came out of. So we put these inventories in. They will have, as I said, all components. Now, again, what goes in the inventory doesn't necessarily go out to the SBOM. There are reasons to not disclose components like under NDA or an internal name that would not necessarily have any meaning to an external user, right? So, again, I can't stress enough. I talk about the inventory. The inventory, if you have everything that you want in that inventory, then the rest of these feed out pretty easily, right? Again, we're putting in the supplier trustworthiness. We're putting in the OSS trustworthiness. Once everything's in there, we have the component. For the most part, anything that's open source, and we're working on this. Nobody here knows that there's a problem sometimes mapping open source to, yeah, I know, right? Surprise, I know. So we are working on, we keep trying to mature that process, right? We work with our SCA vendor. We work internally to create processes. I talked about standardizing things. What I envisioned is that a lot of this will be more standardized with the out-of-factory repository. Everything coming out of there will know exactly what it is. That repository will have all the metadata we need. That metadata gets to us, right? Same thing on the vendor, on the supplier side, right? TPRM will provide us the information in a very standardized format. We can use that. I think it'll make, at the end of the day, it'll make the process a lot easier. But once we have that all in there, we are looking, we haven't done it yet, we're looking to also get our supplier SBOMs in there. So if we can monitor our own, again, think of what I said, inventory is an SBOM, right? If we can do our own inventory into this process, we can do our supplier SBOMs into this process, right? So we can look at those, we can look at their open source, we can monitor them, we can get ahead of our customers. Again, this is all about, being able to tell our customers, yeah, we know what's going on, we know what's in our product, right? But that said, we have to apply the VEX, right? Because we don't want to be, and this goes not just for our supplier SBOMs, but also for our internal SBOMs, right? We're going to want to understand the vulnerabilities, right? So just because we get this in there, we have all these vulnerabilities, we don't necessarily, as part of DMP, understand what the product teams are doing with those vulnerabilities, or the suppliers for that matter. We have to be able to know that. Once we have that, we're automatically opening vulnerability response to, reports. And so the idea is that we're going to automate this process where as soon as a newly identified vulnerability exists, we open a report, it goes to the product teams, we understand their entire inventory. And not only do we understand their inventory, but we understand different parts of that inventory and how they stitch together. So you may have a supplier. We're going to know that supplier. We're going to know where where their inventory sits, how it impacts that product. We're going to know internal components, right? So whether they're publicly known internal components or shared components, we're going to understand all those mappings and be able to provide BUs with better information to make their process a lot easier. So as part of the vulnerability response process, security advisors come out of that, right? We're automating that. We're working on the automation of our security advisories, and as well as VEX in some form. And again, this is to provide, if we're going to provide an SBOM and be transparent, our customers are going to do the same thing, most likely. They're going to bring it into their vulnerability management system, whatever. They're going to start out, pinging us. So I see this vulnerability. Where are you with it? So the VEX, will handle that. One thing I'm just going to state for the record, and this might cause some angst on people's part, but to me, an SBOM, when you talk about an SBOM, it is a very static document. It is the content of the components that went out the door with that release. VEX, on the other hand, is a dynamic, right? So it's a point in time. At this minute, when I'm asking you for this document, what exists? So I'm of the mindset that two should be separate in a pot. But I know that isn't everybody's mindset. And then finally, like I said, metrics, and when Cassi comes up and talks about her pot, she'll talk about how she's using that metric, how she'll use those metrics in her program. Thank you. Okay, so we talked a little bit about OSS trustworthiness. I'm not going to drain the slide, but the idea here, I think I did that well on the other slide. So the idea here is really about, helping, this is all about shifting left, right? Helping product teams make better choices by having certain criteria. And, these are generally the criteria we're looking at, so that we can inform them and give them guidance on making better choices up front. What ends up happening, one of the things I talked about is we have this build pipeline. Well, that build pipeline is constantly evolving, right? That's pre-GA and it's being changed. What we want to do is introduce this, shift left, introduce it into that process so that as they're building, they're making whatever changes they want. Because as soon as it goes to DMP, that's GA. That is a static, it's been released. It's not going to be developed anymore. I think, we can monitor that, we can score trustworthiness on that, and we can help to make better processes, help to educate. But we also want to, like I said, shift left. By the time it gets there, it's a fix at that point, right? There's nothing they can do. I mean, without putting out another release. Thank you. So to sum it up, for dependency management, this is kind of the places that we affect. We got the regulatory, we talk about the EO, we talk about CRA, the trustworthiness for OSS and the supplier trustworthiness, right? Helping teams to make better choices, understanding the types, the quality of the components that are being used, whether they're commercial or OSS. As I said, the inventory is there being monitored, so it's awareness of vulnerabilities. Providing transparency to our customers. So making sure that they understand what we're doing, the processes we're doing, the automation of the remediation, the security advisories, things like that, the VEX, and then finally providing them transparency and hopefully gaining their trust through the distribution of SBOMs. I think that's it for me, so I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Tricia. So as Tricia alluded to, in today's interconnected world, managing risks from external suppliers and partners is crucial for maintaining robust product security. As well, effective third-party risk management practices are essential to support regulatory compliance. Third-party suppliers and partners can introduce vulnerabilities into the ecosystem when our products incorporate or consume their components. So to safeguard against these potential threats, vendors within the ecosystem must conduct due diligence in vetting the maturity of the component supplier's vulnerability, remediation, and disclosure activities. Regular risk assessments and continuous monitoring are vital to identify and mitigate these vulnerabilities. So we intend to hold our suppliers and partners to the same rigorous standards that we hold ourselves to, so that we can ensure adherence to those higher security standards, and thereby protect the overall ecosystem. Next slide. So Tricia mentioned supplier trustworthiness. So these next couple slides will dig into the pieces that will pull all that together. So let's take a look at some of the processes that we envision to help vet the suppliers. To ensure that our suppliers meet our stringent security standards, we'll follow a comprehensive onboarding process. This workflow chart outlines the key high-level steps involved in onboarding a supplier before we even integrate the components into our products. The process begins when our product team identifies the need to onboard a supplier in order to incorporate that component into their product. Next, the supplier completes an inherent risk assessment. This assessment covers various aspects. It may include security, privacy, geopolitical risks, among others, but it helps us to understand that baseline risk that is associated with the supplier. For product security, the inherent risk assessment will trigger a security enhanced due diligence questionnaire. And this questionnaire will evaluate the supplier's security posture and practices. And it's also aligned with the NIST cybersecurity framework and our own internal SDL control catalog. And this ensures that the supplier's security measures are robust, comprehensive, and aligned with our own practices and expectations. Our risk subject matter experts will then review the supplier's responses and provide a risk rating to help us gauge the supplier's overall risk level. And it also informs the business for their decision-making processes, whether or not they want to continue and move forward with the supplier. If any issues or gaps in the supplier's practices are identified, corrective action plans are developed, and in some cases, they may also be incorporated into the terms and conditions of that contract. Alternatively, the business may also choose to accept the risk. Finally, we'll set up continuous monitoring based on the supplier's risk score, and then this will ensure that any emerging risks are identified and addressed to maintain the integrity and security of the product. By following this onboarding process, we can ensure that our suppliers adhere to those highest security standards and protect our product ecosystem and ultimately our customers. That is the end goal. So if we go to the next slide, we have vetted and onboarded the supplier. So now let's explore how we can ensure accountability and continuous monitoring post-contract. Once a supplier is onboarded, maintaining accountability and monitoring their performance and adherence to the security requirements agreed upon in the contract is essential to maintain those higher standards of product security while protecting our ecosystem. So this workflow chart outlines some of the steps to address issues and ensure suppliers adhere to those security standards. The process gets kicked off by the product team when an issue arises with a security fix. We rely on the supplier to provide that fix for the component that we're consuming from them. But sometimes, for various reasons, they may not deliver the necessary fix. In those cases, for level 1 escalations, the product team directly contacts the supplier to address the issue. Delays in resolving these issues can lead to increased vulnerability exposure, which has the potential to result in breaches and compromise customer trust. So to minimize delays, we want to make sure we're driving towards a swift resolution. If the level 1 escalation is unsuccessful, the product team can escalate the issue to the PSIRT. The PSIRT will attempt a PSIRT to PSIRT escalation where they'll engage with the supplier's security team to address the issue. If the level 2 escalation is also unsuccessful, the product team can then escalate the issue to the TPRM program, third-party risk management program. This step involves coordinated efforts across the product team, the PSIRT team, and the TPRM team. So together, these teams will come together. They'll create a vulnerability data report for the product team's vice president. The report may include details such as the agreed upon terms and conditions within the contract, the supplier's risk profile, the specific vulnerability remediation issue that triggered the escalation, and any historical evidence of previous issues with the supplier. The product team will then escalate the issue to their VP, providing them with the vulnerability data report for a VP to VP conversation with the supplier. The VP will communicate the results from the engagement, detailing the supplier's response and any agreed upon actions. Depending on the outcome of the engagement, the supplier will either adhere to the terms and conditions and provide the necessary fix, or other actions for resolution may take place and be considered. In some cases, this may include terminating the partnership. But by following this process, we can ensure that our suppliers remain compliant with our security standards and address any issues promptly. Slide. So we've discussed the pre-contract phase. We've discussed the post-contract process. Now let's explore how to leverage the data coming from these processes and how we integrate it back into the PSIRT. Establishing supplier product remediation effectiveness key performance indicators monitors and evaluates supplier responsiveness to product security issues. When vulnerabilities arise that depend on an external supplier, we can track several key metrics. These may include responsiveness to security issues by measuring how long it takes our suppliers to provide a security fix for the dependency from the initial contact date. Another one is an overall effectiveness percentage. So this goes back into the supplier trustworthiness score. This metric evaluates the overall effectiveness of each supplier in addressing the security vulnerabilities. And finally, contractual and risk assessment data. So we'll consider whether or not we have a signed contract with a supplier and the risk rating from the pre-contract vetting process. And by tracking these KPIs, we can ensure that our suppliers are meeting our product security expectations. This data, which Cassi will go to in just a minute further, This data is crucial for our PSIRT to continuously monitor and enhance the product remediation processes for our dependencies, thereby fostering and improving the overall vulnerability management ecosystem. Next slide, please. One of the most significant outcomes of effective third-party risk management is increased customer trust. TPRM is a vital component of any product security strategy. By assessing and mitigating risks from external suppliers and partners, we can maintain higher standards of security. Encouraging supplier accountability is also crucial. By holding third-party suppliers to those higher security standards, we foster a culture of accountability and continuous improvement within the product security ecosystem. And this approach not only enhances our overall security posture, but also ensures that our suppliers are committed to maintaining these standards. Ensuring that components from suppliers meet our rigorous security standards is essential for reducing the risk of vulnerabilities in our products and helps us deliver secure products to our customers, thereby reinforcing their trust in our brand. Ultimately, our commitment to rigorous TPRM practices fosters greater confidence among our customers. So I'll hand it over to Cassi.
All right, thanks, Julia. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about how, as the product security incident response team, we're going to be using some of the outputs of the DMP and TPRM in order to feed it back into our PSIRT operations. So for the folks that maybe haven't gotten the wonderful experience of working in a product security incident response team before, essentially what my team does is we take in any vulnerability reports for any Dell product. It flows through our team, whether that's found internally, whether it's found by a security researcher, found by root cause analysis, whether it's a scan. It all is going to flow through the Dell PSIRT. And what we're really going to be able to do with these outputs is start to expand. I think when we think of traditional PSIRT, it's really just driving those remediations, getting things over to product teams. We're the hounders. We're going to come bother you and we're going to ask for our fixes. But we're really going to start becoming the ultimate consumers, right? So when we look at the outputs from TPRM and from DMP, we're going to be taking in the product software inventories. We're going to be having those vulnerability findings from software composition analysis. We're going to be able to use the supplier security requirement agreements, the supplier SBOMs, and of course, from our suppliers, their advisories and their VEC statements as well. So to show a little bit about how we're going to be using these collaterals to help with the PSIRT operations, I've mapped this a bit to our traditional kind of PSIRT framework. So usually in the PSIRT side, we kind of bucketize things. We discover an issue, we determine whether or not we're impacted by that issue in triage and analysis. If it's a real issue, we fix it. And of course, once we fix it, we're going to tell you about it so you can reduce the risk in your own environment. So I've kind of split this up across 3 different pillars here. So the first line here is talking about how we're using that open source software trustworthiness in the PSIRT. So we're going to have that dependency inventory that Tricia's working on alongside the SEA results. And this is going to allow us to quickly identify vulnerabilities in open source software dependencies. And in the past, kind of like Tricia was saying, where we might need to, open up a ticket with every product team to determine if they're affected by something, we'll now be able to use the SEA results to automatically open those tickets for the product teams that might be affected so that they can do a review. And then on the remediation side, right, now that we have our trusted open source, or at least ones that we think are trustworthy, the product team has a decision to make. They can either patch it, fork it, replace it. And that's, of course, going to drive us to that disclosure pillar. The next one on here is looking a little bit more at the TPRM program. So how are we working with our suppliers? So once we have those supplier SBOMs in the discovery phase, that's really going to help us map the supplier dependency to whatever they're calling that component back to the product so that we know when that supplier lets us know either through their VEC statements or through an advisory that they're affected by something, we know which product teams need to go in and take a look at it. And then we're also going to be able to use that to have visibility into the supplier software, allowing us to do assessment beyond just that initial impact. And then, of course, remediation, the supplier SBOMs help us identify what are the affected dependencies so we know which ones to update. On the last line here, looking a bit more at the suppliers, using some of those supplier risk ratings that TPRM and Julia is going to be putting together, we're going to know which suppliers we need to keep a closer eye on. You know, are there things that we're finding out about that they maybe didn't put in their advisory, or maybe they don't have VEX statements yet, and we need to follow those suppliers a bit more closely. Maybe it's a trusted supplier and we know, you know, what's in their VEX statement and what's coming out in their advisories. We can trust that and we can quickly push those off for the product team for review. Those security supplier agreements that Julia was talking about that escalation plans really helps put PSIRT in a where we're not just hounding, we're not just bothering. People, the product teams can now come to us and say, hey, I'm having an issue. You want me to fix this? I need the fix for my supplier first. And having those agreements make sure that we have something to stand on when we go to the supplier and said, hey, you said you were gonna do this. You know, we're asking that you do it now, please. And then, of course, on the remediation side, those supplier security agreements also have the SLAs. So, you know, what did you agree to as a supplier to give us the fixes so that Dell can then give those fixes to our customers? So again, that really goes back into that supplier accountability piece. So we're driving for those remediations. And of course, that's going to bring us, all of these lead back to disclosure. So once we have that remedy, we're going to be able to publish advisories. Our goal is to do that via an API where customers can just pull down our advisories, pull in our VEX statements, and they can very quickly, and as they mature in a more automated way, say, yes, I'm affected, no, I'm not affected, and hopefully get to the point where, you know, with all the collateral providing, they don't even have to call us anymore to say, am I affected by this vulnerability? They'll have the VEX statement and they'll just know, and they'll go to lunch, whatever they like to do. You know, they can call to say hello. And then the updated inventory, right? So making sure that our customer-facing SBOMs and supplier SBOMs, once something's remediated, we have that new SBOM to reflect what the changes were. Oh, and there we are. Oh, we got the vulnerabilities. And of course, again, this all goes back to customer trust. You know, we're all very passionate about security, but we really do it so we can protect our customers. So what this is going to allow the PSIRT to do is help the business get to faster and more effective vulnerability response by leveraging this collateral and using these security requirement agreements. We can quickly identify, assess, and drive alongside the business to provide fixes to customers more quickly. And this increased customer transparency and trust. Customers really benefit from these machine readable advisories and from CSAF and VEX. You know, customers that I know Crow was joking, but they don't want to call us. They want to focus on their job and make sure they're getting things moving. And of course, stronger security and compliance assurance. You know, we're doing all of these things because it's the right thing to do, but it also helps us meet those compliance requirements. It's a win for everybody. So with that, we're going to transition over into Q&A. You have a question, Patricia?
Oh, yes, I did, as a matter of fact. So TPRM, we focused a lot on supplier. And, you know, one of the things with open source, we talk at the component level. Is there a plan to get to that level and understand trustworthiness at that level, component version type?
Yes, that's the ultimate goal, but we have to put the other pieces in place to get there. So that's what we're doing with this, but we envision getting to that component level.
Discord question, or should I ask it for you?
I prefer you to.
All right. If I could get you up here. Well, I'm gonna ask my Discord question first then. So it's a two-parter. How is Dell working around the static nature of the data in SBOMs? Or stated differently, is this an effective source of information for PSIRT if the data is not always fully up to date?
Yeah, so Tricia was talking about how SBOM was kind of it's a place and time, but it's also important to know, like she was saying, we also have access to that inventory. But when we're thinking about what customers have in their environment, they're going to have what we released, right? So even though the SBOM is static, if they're on that particular version and we have the SBOM and inventory for that version, the static nature of it is correct, right? But we're updating those VEX statements so that as those components get new vulnerabilities, which we know is happening all the time, we can provide dynamic responses with our advisories and VEX statements.
So when I talk about registering inventory, every product that Dell creates for every release will be registering their inventory and creating an SBOM. So as a customer updates their software, they go pull they'll have access to a corresponding SBOM to that.
I have to finish writing my note or I'll forget what you said. All right, and then this guy we know as Crow had this question. Dell's plans to address the CRAs ask the manufacturer supply fixes back upstream. Does this inventory process help enable that request?
Yes.
Next fair, okay. That one didn't go as planned. I think that's all I have. Just for. Oh, you wanted me to ask part 2 of that?
It wasn't part 2, it's a separate question.
The one about the feelings?
No.
Trustworthiness score for OSS. How does Dell plan to address critical OSS components that don't meet your minimal acceptable bar for risk appetite?
Sure. Okay. How does Dell plan to address critical OSS components that don't meet your minimum acceptable bar for risk appetite?
So we talked about the trusted repository, right? That's going to be a BU function. And they're going to have those gates and control those gates of what risk is acceptable and is not. If it gets through to the SCA, there are in the build process, there are actual gateways there as well. So based on vulnerabilities, critical, high, whatever, I apologize. There's some work still going on there. So I think originally it was critical high. They're thinking they may adjust that. It will fail the build. It'll actually fail the build and go back and they have to do something. But I think the end state, if we talk about it, is really that everything's in that trusted repository and is being assessed before they're ever pulling it out of there.
Yeah, and I think a good distinction to make too on the OSS trustworthiness, it's to help the developers make good decisions while developing, not necessarily setting the threshold for the things we're going to remediate. So if it's a vulnerability, we're going to strive to remediate it. That open source software trustworthiness is really to help them make the good decisions. So we're hopefully either seeing less vulnerabilities or, using open source with maintainers that we know are trying their best to keep things updated.
Lisa, do you have a question?
Eventually, we plan to provide a product 360 view to our executives. So this dashboard will look at each product from the product level and we'll be able to see any and all metrics, risks, compliance for that product, all consolidated together. The trustworthiness scores that we talked about will feed into this along with any other metrics. Did I cover it? Okay.
All right, and then since we've got time, I'll ask one more question from Discord. This is from Josh A. Do you require SBOMs, leverage source-based SCA, or do you accept binary?
So this is way off in the future. So right now we are doing source-based inventories. The eventuality, my plan long-term is to try to get to a point where we're correlating that source inventory against the binary inventory, the inventory produced as a binary scan, so that we can, again, if you go back to what I said earlier, we check for quality based on the document and what the fields that are included and things like that, but we can't check to make sure everything's there, right? We can't check at the component level. What we're hoping is, what our goal is, and it's a while out, it's probably at least a 3-year plan for me, is to look at the binary, compare that to what's being produced for the inventory and be able to find differences and have it addressed. Does that answer the question? I think it does.
All right, any more questions in the room? All right, Steve, take us away.
All right, thanks. Let's big round of applause for Julia, Cassie, and Patricia.